Good evening and welcome. My name is Linda Chambers, one of the FCPS Special Education Directors. Tonight we welcome you here formally to a very important, informative discussion that's being co-presented by the ARC of Frederick County Public Schools, the Special Education Citizens Advisory Committee, and the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. We formally welcome Interim Superintendent Dr. Michael Marco, as well as Board of Education members Liz Barrett, Sue Johnson, Karen Yoho, and David Bass. Additionally, we have many members of our CCAC and the community and family members in the audience, and we welcome you here today and those of you watching on the live stream. Tonight's informative discussion agenda will include time for questions after our speakers. Therefore, we respectfully request that you hold your questions until that time. We ask you to silence your phones at this time, and additionally, to not hook into the ARC free network, as it may interrupt the live stream. A very special thank you to the ARC of Frederick County for offering this space and hosting this informative discussion. Now we will continue with further introductions.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Troy Keller. I'm the other director of special ed. It's nice to see everyone tonight.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Aaron Stevens, the Special Projects Director with the ARC of Frederick County. I'd like to welcome you all to the ARC of Frederick County, and I'd like to thank Frederick County Public Schools and CCAC for hosting this event tonight. We're very looking forward to hearing from Guy from the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Patty Comans. I love to tell everybody that I am a retired Frederick County special ed teacher after 17 years. But anyway, my job tonight is to, but I'm also the co-chair of CCAC. Sorry about that. My role tonight is to introduce Guy Stevens. He is a Maryland father whose autistic son, Cooper, was restrained, secluded, and traumatized in a Maryland school. Guy made a promise to his son that he would do anything necessary to make sure that what happened to Cooper did not happen again. 3 years ago, Guy started the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint to raise awareness and promote legislative change to reduce and eliminate the use of restraint and seclusion. Guy is a board member for the ARC of Maryland and a member of the Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates, known as COPA. The Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint is a member of the Alliance to Prevent Restraint, Adversive Interventions, and Seclusion. It's my pleasure to welcome Guy Stevens.
Thank you very much. Well, hello and good evening, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. As she said, my name is Guy Stevens. We're going to have just a conversation this evening, and I want to share a little bit with you about my family's story and about the experience that we had, and kind of understand, where you might be as well and where you might be coming from. I don't have a set presentation, but more of a discussion. But I really wanted to start with something very simple. And for any of you that have been impacted by restraint or seclusion, or had your families impacted by restraint or seclusion, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that has happened to you. I'm sorry that that's happened to your family. I know firsthand how difficult it is when something like this happens to your children. I know how traumatic it is, not just for the children that are involved, but also for us as parents and caregivers. So, I want you to know that I have, and still am, where you are in terms of this is something that happened to my son, and it's something that led me down kind of a rather unexpected journey. But I'm here tonight in hopes that some of the things that I've learned through my journey might be helpful to you, to the folks here that are trying to bring At any rate, just want to start out by saying I'm very sorry about the experiences that you've had and what your children have experienced as well. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey, and you've already had my introduction. What I'll tell you is that 3.5 years ago, when this happened to my son, I never would have imagined I'd be sitting in front of you today talking about this. But my life has completely changed over the last 3.5 years, because when this happened to my son, I knew I had to do something to make sure it didn't happen to him again or didn't happen to other children like him. So I started the Alliance, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. But I first wanted to introduce my son. This is my son, Cooper. This was actually a couple years ago. I've got more recent photos with me as well. If you were to go find him recently, probably at our house, he would likely be looking to cut down a tree, because that seems to be his newest hobby. We live in Calvert County, and Calvert County is actually quite a bit like Frederick. We're kind of a more rural county. Interestingly enough, as I was sharing earlier, my father actually grew up in Frederick. And recently on his 81st birthday, I brought him back here because he wanted to see Frederick and tell us all about where he grew up. So we've got a kind of a connection here as well. But Cooper's a great kid. He loves science, he loves nature, he likes being outdoors. But he was diagnosed, he's neurodivergent, he was diagnosed with ADHD. One point he was diagnosed as autistic, with some anxiety. He always needed a little additional support in school. And that went well in many cases, but unfortunately it did not always go well. He's pictured there with his dog. That's his dog, Scout. And Scout means a lot to my son and has helped him as he's even been healing from his trauma. But I want to tell you a little bit about what happened to our family in terms of restraint and seclusion. The first time my son was ever physically restrained and secluded was actually when he was just 6 years old. He was in the first grade. He was out on the playground. We knew at that point, he did not have a formal diagnosis, but we knew at that point he had some difficulties. And unfortunately, he was out on the playground and did not want to come back in. That escalated. It escalated rather quickly to a point where he was physically restrained and carried in, put into an empty office. When he got in there, he was so distraught by being picked up and handled the way that he was. He did something that was very unusual. At least it seemed unusual to me at the time. He took off all his clothing. Now, what I now know is that was a stress response. That was a trauma response. He was so upset at what had happened to him that he was literally ripping his clothing off to not feel what he was feeling. If you fast forward, we moved him at the end of that school year into a program in our county called the IL program. It was a small structured learning environment for kids that had similar challenges. What I would say to you now, of course, is that I'm a big believer in inclusion and would have loved to have had him with his general education peers. But at the time, it seemed like it might be a good option. And in fact, he did really well. In fact, he did so well, we probably, reboot. That's what Windows likes to do for you. It likes to give you the reboot message. We're going to continue working, and hopefully it will as well. So, we got him in this program, and he started to do well. And one of the reasons I think he did so well is he had a very caring team of teachers that were working with him, a very understanding team. And for the next several years, he was not restrained or secluded. He succeeded. He moved out into inclusion for more and more classes. By the time we got to the 5th grade, he was in inclusion for all but one of his classes. So perhaps the road you might want to see for a kid that needed some more help, but eventually, kind of moving out into a less restrictive setting. In the 5th grade, he was in inclusion for all but one class. Unfortunately, towards the end of that 5th grade year, he had a particular teacher he'd been working with for about 2.5 years. Very important to him, very connected with him. She got in a car accident, and when that happened, she wasn't able to come back to school. Suddenly, we began to see behaviors from my son we hadn't seen for 5 years. Things like elopement. My son very early was an eloper. If he got overwhelmed, he might have ended up under a desk or running down a hallway, if he didn't feel safe. And unfortunately, now having that happen 5 years later, it was quite a surprise. And we began to try to work with the team to figure out what was going on. Unfortunately, there were 2 situations where he eloped. He hid in a bathroom. He was clearly overwhelmed. He eventually came out of the bathroom only to be physically restrained, drugged down a hallway, and thrown into an empty classroom. I got the call the second time this had happened, and I went to pick up my son. When I walked into that room, I had never seen him so dysregulated. He had thrown things, he had knocked things over, he had physically tried to climb out the window. I asked everyone to leave, and I began to try to get him regulated enough to leave. But these two instances that happened at the end of 5th grade were so traumatic that he was afraid to return back to school. And we actually made a hard decision then, and it was after a lot of thought, and that decision was we homeschooled him. And we did that for the next 2 years. Not because that had necessarily been our idea of what the best thing to do was, but he was part of that decision-making process, and he did not feel safe going back. This had had a tremendous impact. So we homeschooled him for 2 years, and things went reasonably well. Not to say that every, oops, now it doesn't want to work with me at all anymore, but that's okay. If it doesn't, so be it. Not to say that every day was perfect or every day was easy, but at the same time, he continued to make progress. And at the end of 2 years, he said to us, I want to go back to the public school. He said, I want to be with friends. Now, I had always advocated for my son, probably like many of you. I know that we've got people here from the Special Education Citizens Advisory Committee, and any of you that are showing up here today have probably been people that have been advocating for your children for some time. I'd always advocated for my son. When he was diagnosed, I read Emotions to Advocacy. I tried to figure out how I could advocate to make sure he had the things he needed. Didn't matter to me what diagnoses he had. What mattered to me was, what does he need to be successful? This is a kid I believe in. And through that, even when he was out of school, I continued to try to learn more. And the first time my son was restrained and secluded, the school never used the words restraint and seclusion. They never said we restrained your child. They never said we secluded your child. But in fact, that happened. They never provided me with any kind of report to say this is what happened. And in fact, the first time I heard the words restraint and seclusion in the context of a school, it was somewhat unbelievable to me. I would have never imagined that kids might have been physically restrained on the ground or sitting or standing. Would have never imagined that happening. So we get to the point right before the 8th grade where he decides he wants to go back. We work with the school and the school district through the IP process to try to get him back into a setting with supports where he would be successful. We made a lot of effort. We talked to every administrator in the building. We talked about what had happened at the end of 5th grade, how vital it was to not use a hands-on approach, how that escalated my son. Unfortunately, despite all of our work and all of our effort, he returned to school in 2018 in the fall to go back in the 8th grade. He was going back into a self-contained environment in a larger public school setting, and he was there for 15 days. And over those 15 days, he was restrained and or secluded at least 4 times. We think it was probably 7 or 8 times. It was only reported twice. After that happened, at the end of the 15 days, there was a particularly traumatic event. And you know where we were again? I had a kid that was excited to go back to school that was afraid to go back to school. And, the first thing we did, and I say first thing, it probably wasn't the very first thing, but we began thinking about, what do we do right now? What do we do in the short term? I have a child that doesn't want to go to school. I was even concerned that there might be truancy claims because we weren't sending him, but he was afraid. I couldn't get him on a bus. We ended up agreeing through the IP process the home and hospital setting. And that's one place where our story took a positive turn, in that they selected a home and hospital teacher that had been teaching for over 50 years. And any of you that are quickly doing the math will probably realize that man was in his 70s. His name was Steve. We called him Mr. Steve. Mr. Steve came out to our house, and the first thing he did was get to know my son, build a relationship with my son. I will tell you now, 3 years later, Mr. Steve is still in our lives. In fact, Mr. Steve was at my house today visiting my son. My son will be at his house on Saturday helping with his yard work. Not only did we have a person that came into our house and helped my son and built a relationship, never did he have to put hands on my son, never did he have to restrain or seclude my son. He worked with him very successfully at a time where my son was very vulnerable. That was a positive part. But at that same time, I'm thinking, why did this happen? How could this happen? How often does this happen? I was one parent. Just seeing all of you that have been affected. I would have loved to have connected with somebody that knew what I was going through, what our family was going through. It was really difficult. So I began doing research, and I made a promise to my son. And the promise I made to my son was, look, what happened to you should not have happened. This was not okay. This is not an okay way to work with kids that are having a difficult time. And I'll be clear, If you look at Maryland state law, it says kids should not be restrained and or secluded unless it's a crisis situation that involves imminent serious physical harm. Those few words have a very strong meaning. It basically is a life or death situation. Yet the times my son was restrained and secluded for failing to come back in from the playground or hiding in the bathroom certainly were not situations that met that standard. When he was back in school in the 8th grade, once for splashing water, once for throwing a book, not throwing a book at anybody, just throwing a book, things that would not have even met our legal criteria. So I began asking the question, why is this happening? Who's it happening to? And I promised my son that I would do anything in my power to make sure it didn't happen to him again or others like him. And that's really why I'm here today. I took that promise very seriously. Where things went from there as I began looking at the data. Fortunately, in 2017, there was a law passed in Maryland that required data collection at a state level for restraint and seclusion data. Now, I'll tell you, the State Department of Education did not make that easy for people to find. I only found it because I had a connection at the department. I got a copy of the report. I analyzed the data. And that first report that came out in the December 5th, I think it was, of 2018, when I looked at that data and I looked at it against enrollment, look at the number of kids, the number of instances, what I found was that my little school district, Calvert County, 16th out of 23 school districts, we were number 1 in the use of seclusion and number 2 in the use of restraint. Why? Another interesting point for you is that Frederick County was number 1 at that point in restraint and number 2 in the use of seclusion. Again, why? What was unique about Frederick or what was unique about Calvert County? What I'm going to share with you is kind of what happened after that. And what happened after that was that we began to look at the data, try to understand what was happening, and take some action. Now, I do want to frame this conversation a little bit in that, this is hard for me even to talk to you today about what happened to my son. There are times that I get a bit emotional about this, but, I came to a conclusion that we needed to do something different. We needed to impact change. And I knew that to some degree, to do that, I had to separate myself a little from all of that raw emotion, which is, I'm sure that some of you have felt, very angry, very upset, to try to influence change. And what I want to do is just say that in the spirit of that, this is a difficult conversation. I really thank Frederick County Public Schools for inviting me out to share my story, in CCAC and the ARC. It's not an easy conversation, but I know that since all of this has occurred, I had a chance to come up and talk to a number of the folks here at Frederick County Public Schools. I know that there's a lot of effort being made to try to get things moving in a better direction. But this is a hard conversation. It's a hard conversation for us as parents. It's a hard conversation for people that found themselves in a situation that I'm sure they would rather not have been in. But now we're trying to figure out how they can do something to, improve and get away from where we are. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we're talking. Although there's a lot, I still have anger inside of me. But at the same time, change is so much more powerful. A week ago, I was in front of Congress talking about the Keeping All Students Safe Act, advocating for them to pass federal law regarding restraint and seclusion, because we have none in terms of schools in the country. We have laws in hospital settings and in police settings, but not in our schools. Today, I was at the Maryland Senate providing testimony on a Maryland bill that would actually ban seclusion in all public schools across the state. Our state superintendent came there today, and much to my surprise and delight, joined in supporting the legislation and saying that he believes that we should ban seclusion everywhere. There are some things happening that I think are positive, but nonetheless, I just want to acknowledge this is hard. This is hard for all of us. So let me tell you what happened after I did my research. After I did my research, first thing I wanted to understand was who was being impacted, what was the impact, and what could we be doing differently? And as I began to dig into that, what did I find? Well, the first thing I found is that most often the kids being impacted are very young kids with disabilities. Black and brown children, disproportionately restrained and secluded. Children with a trauma history. And this one's really important because if you begin to understand what trauma does to the brain and the impact of trauma, you begin to understand why children with disabilities, why children with a trauma history might be having stress-related behaviors that are sometimes viewed through the wrong lens as being disruptive or manipulative or whatever else that are leading to things like restraint and seclusion. So as I looked at who was affected, we have a federal data set from the Office of Civil Rights. And if any of you know this, they've been collecting data since about 2009. 2019, the Government Accountability Office said, hey, there's lots of problems with your data. You're not getting complete data on this. It's an important issue. In fact, there was a county, Fairfax County, Virginia, was put through a federal lawsuit about their use of restraint and seclusion. One of the factors there was that they were reporting no use of restraint and seclusion when in fact they were using it significantly. So when we look at the data, we know who's impacted. Kids with disabilities, black and brown children, children with a trauma history, and very young children. We're not talking about 15 or 16-year-olds. We're most often, my son was an outlier by the time he was last physically restrained and secluded. We're most often talking 5, 6, and 7-year-olds. And if you go back to that idea that you should only be using these things in situations of imminent serious physical harm, the question is, how often are life and death situations occurring with these very small disabled children? I would say much more often, and not, again, not just in Frederick, it was happening in my county. It is happening across counties in the state where these interventions are being used when they shouldn't be. That's a significant problem. But after understanding who was affected, I wanted to understand what the impact was. And there are 3 things: trauma, it's serious injuries, and it's even death. Sorry, my mic acting funny there. What we know is that kids that are restrained and secluded, it's something that's physically, if you were to see it, it looks violent. You see somebody being put down to the ground or being held, kind of rocked back and held, or having their arms wrapped around them. It is traumatic. It is a traumatic intervention. And again, that's why the bar was so high at the state level to say we should only do these things if it really is a life or death situation. But what I found in my county was they were using restraint and seclusion frequently for safety concerns. Now, there's a mountain of difference between safety and life or death. Unfortunately, a very common interpretation throughout the state was that when children were unsafe, we would use these things if we needed to. So trauma is significant. Trauma affects our brains. And I didn't set out to learn a lot about neurobiology, but I've learned more than I ever planned. But what you begin to understand is the way trauma affects the brain, it literally changes your brain. And it changes your brain in such a way that you are more likely to be what they would call hypervigilant. Hypervigilant means you're always on a detection system that's kind of running on high. And that threat detection system means that your internal detector may be going off in situations that might be safe, but you don't feel safe. And when a child doesn't feel safe, a child might have distress behaviors. So what you begin to see is that kids with a trauma history, and I would say to you, many children with disabilities have experienced trauma directly related to their disability. If you have a communication challenge or difference, or you're non-speaking, that can be extremely traumatizing. So you start off with some trauma, and that trauma can lead to hypervigilance. That hypervigilance can lead to distress behaviors. Now, what sometimes happens is that those stress behaviors are looked at to be intentional. They're looked at to be manipulative. They're looked at to be challenging. They're looked at to be non-compliant. And if you start out with that lens, what will often happen is you will put demands on the child, compliance demands on the child, who's already having a hard time. And as they're unable to meet those demands, they will escalate. And as they escalate, what we'll see is there's an increased chance that they might be restrained, secluded, suspended, expelled. In some states, 19 states still use corporal punishment. So these things happen, and if a child experiences one of those things, what does it do? It causes further trauma. That further trauma means that they're more sensitive in the future to feeling unsafe. So the more you use these interventions, the more apt the child is to feel unsafe, the more apt it is to happen again and again. Staff that are using these interventions are also traumatized. Children that watch are traumatized. As staff begin to feel unsafe, they might also become hypervigilant. So it leads into the same kind of circle where staff that have used these interventions may be more apt to go to these interventions more quickly in the future because of their own feeling of lack of safety. So that trauma piece is really important. Of course, we know kids have broken bones, scratches, bruises, all sorts of injuries. I've seen, unfortunately, far too many pictures of kids that have been injured. We know that teachers and staff have had, broken orbital sockets, have had serious injuries, broken noses. What I will tell you is that the most likely occurrence of an injury occurs during the act of restraining or secluding someone, because you cannot restrain or seclude a child and maintain safety. Now, people will sometimes say, well, we're trained in safe restraint. There is no such thing as a safe restraint. There is reducing risk. And reducing risk means that if you are properly trained, you are reducing the risk. But when you go hands-on, if I were to go hands-on here with Aaron right now, he would escalate. His heart rate would increase, his breathing would increase, he would begin to perspire. He would probably enter a fight or flight mode. And when that happens, your arms will flail, you will try to get away. Your body is trying to protect or save itself. So we know what happens in one of these situations is that people are more likely to respond in a way that someone might get injured. So we have injuries, we have trauma, and sadly kids have died being put in physical restraint. We were talking about Georgia earlier. A young man in Georgia hung himself in a seclusion room. Cornelius Frederick, a young man in a school in Michigan, was in a cafeteria, threw a sandwich. 6 staff restrained him. He died. These things can happen as well. So the impact is significant. We know who's impacted. We know what the impact is. The question then is, what can we do about it? I worked very hard with our local school district, and we formed a committee. I won't say that all of that was easy, but we formed a committee, and we began talking about what we could do to change. And one of the first questions that I was asked, and at that point, 3 years ago, I wasn't really prepared to answer, was what else do you expect us to do? What do you expect us to do when this happens? And I would get a number of different kinds of scenarios. Usually scenarios that I would say weren't life-threatening, but probably not scenarios you'd like to see. And at that point, I didn't have a good answer, but I said, I'll be back. And I began doing a lot of research. I began looking for what are the better things that we can and should be doing. How do we avoid getting into these situations in the first place? It's not just a matter of having a better crisis intervention approach. How can we actually avoid getting to crisis in the first place? How can we be proactive rather than reactive? And I found a number of different approaches. One of the things that I began researching was something called Ukeru. That's spelled U-K-E-R-U. People pronounce it about 10 different ways. It comes from a Japanese word, and the word actually means to receive, and there's a reason behind that. Ukeru is a trauma-informed approach. It uses a lot of kind of brain science, but it also uses this idea of kind of not harming relationships, understanding what's going on in the brain, understanding how to help people that are having a hard time. In fact, they call it a comfort versus control approach. So rather than trying to physically control someone, you're trying to provide them comfort when they are at their worst. So they have a saying that when they're at their worst, we need to be at our best. That's an approach that does involve a physical intervention, but it's one that involves kind of using these specialized blocking pads. Not in an offensive way, but if Aaron was upset, I wouldn't be going after him with the pad. I'd rather be backing away, making myself a little smaller, using a very calm voice. We don't want to do harm. And when we restrain and seclude a kid, my son still remembers the man that restrained him in the 5th grade. If he sees him out in the grocery store, we'll have a reaction to it. That can be unrepairable harm that can be done. So with the Ukeru approach, it's all about kind of comfort versus control. That's one approach. Another approach that we brought in. So in my county, we worked as a committee. We came up with ideas for changing our policy, and then we came up with a plan for training. The other thing that we did is we offered training in something called collaborative and proactive solutions. That's an approach developed by Dr. Ross Green and Stuart Abalon. The idea behind the approach is very simple. It starts out with this very simple idea that kids do well if they can. That doesn't sound like anything earth-shaking, but if we look at what very often happens in our schools, very often the idea is kids do well if they want to. And if you believe that kids do well if they want to, how do you respond to behavior? You offer rewards, you offer consequences, you offer schedules, reinforcement schedules, and many times those don't work for the kids that really need help. So what we find is the kids that really need help, they're not doing poorly because they want to do poorly. They're often having a hard time, lacking a skill, lacking the ability to do well. If kids do well if they could, why aren't they doing well? In math, if a kid was having a hard time, we would have an intervention to help them develop math skills. When behaviors occur, we need to look at it in the same way. What are they having a difficult time with? And if we can look at that, we can proactively work with children to say, what can we offer to help them develop skills so they can respond more adaptively and not have these kind of challenges in the future. We brought in those 2 interventions, and I'll share a little bit of data with you, and I don't know how I'm doing on time. Okay, great. So if we go back 3.5 years ago, I told you that our county was very high. We had about 700 and some seclusions, almost 600 restraints. About 2.5 years ago, they began the pilot programs with UCARO. About 2 years ago, they began the pilot programs with Collaborative Proactive Solutions. We now, as of about 3 weeks ago, for the current school year, a school year which, by the way, is exceedingly difficult, and anybody that is with the school can probably relate. You know why? We've all been through this traumatic time with COVID and with the world being upside down. That's had an impact on our kids. That's had an impact on our teachers and staff. And one of the concerns I had 1.5 years ago was that as kids went back to school with this new trauma in their backpacks, it was going to be a tough time. We might see an increase in distressed behavior. And that distressed behavior, if looked at through a lens of being manipulative or meaning purposeful with what you're doing, can lead to a lot of really punitive consequences. So we're in a tough time, but we took those numbers, and in the current year, as of about 3 weeks ago, we had 10 restraints and 1 seclusion. As of next month, seclusion will be completely banned from our system. We had limited it previously to make it very difficult to use seclusion. But look at those numbers, from 700 and some to 500 and some. The question is, what had to change? And what I'll tell you is training is helpful, but the biggest change that's really needed is about culture. It's about moving away from a punitive culture. And, this is not to be judgmental. We are kind of where we are. In my district, why were our numbers so much higher than the surrounding districts? It was culture and training. One of the things that happened was we used the train-the-trainer model. We had one primary crisis intervention person that essentially trained the entire school. And unfortunately, they weren't really training them on what the law said in terms of when you might use an intervention like restraint and seclusion. So as a result, they were using it with anything that seemed unsafe. I would say to you, and some may not agree with me, but if children can die being physically restrained, and again, take a very young child and take a much larger adult restraining them, or multiple adults, children can die being physically restrained. So I look at that through the lens to say that physical restraint is potentially deadly force. You do not want to use a potentially deadly force for a situation that does not warrant it. And unfortunately, that's what's happened, not just here in Frederick or in Calvert County. I would tell you that it happens across the state, it happens across the country, it happens across the world. We have people in our community with the Alliance now from New Zealand, from Australia, United Kingdom, all over the world. And, we're making progress, but it's slow. It takes a long time, and those of you in education probably know far more about this than I do, but it takes a long time to turn a big ship. And education can be a big ship, and it can take a long time to make shifts. And as a result, we often find that, the science being used about behavior is lagging. We had, in the 1990s, the decade of the brain. We learned more about the brain, we learned more about neuroscience, we learned more about trauma, yet those approaches haven't made it to many of our schools. We could be supporting children much more effectively with a lot of that science. So I wanted to make the point that we were able to, in Calvert County, and again, this was not easy. When I began to advocate for this change, I was one voice. And I knew that what happened to my son was not right. But people weren't lining up to listen to what I had to say. And when I first reached out to our local school board, thank you for your concern. We'll look into it. But things weren't progressing. I put pressure on however I could. Our story was covered in the media. I worked with local organizations like, the ARC was one I worked with, Disability Rights Maryland, others. I asked them to write to my board and tell them about their concerns about the use of restraint and seclusion. But eventually we came to the table, and it was not an easy process. The first meeting that we had, this restraint and seclusion committee that we had, I'd done my research. I had about a 100-page document with all the research I'd done about why we can, do better. But that very first meeting was really stressful. I went there, I remember my heart kind of pounding out of my chest. But what I quickly found is that as I talked to people that I thought might have had far different opinions, they weren't as different as I thought. And eventually we were able to come together and change our policy. And I'll tell you, not everybody was on board with it. There certainly are people that even probably today feel that they need these, and I always hate the word tools, but they would say we need these tools in our toolbox. I would say to you, there are far better things that we can and should be doing to support kids. There are other things that we can do that aren't going to cause harm. But it was a difficult process. But in the end, now as I talk to you 3 years later, we made a huge change. I wish, in many ways, I wish I wasn't here today. I wish that what happened to my son had never happened to him. But after it happened, I was committed to making sure it didn't happen to him again. And I'll never forget, after we passed the new policy in our county and we had the new training getting ready to go into effect, Cooper looks at me and goes, "So Dad, does this mean you're done with all this restraint and seclusion stuff?" I said, "No." I said, "Because if we move tomorrow, the same thing could happen again." But beyond that, the realization that hit me was that there were a lot of other kids that this was happening to. And I will always be a voice for my children, but not everybody has somebody in their corner. And it's not even for a reason that they don't have anybody that cares or loves them. It may be that they have one parent who's working 2 jobs and isn't able to get engaged. It might be that they have had a severely traumatic background. When I talk about who's impacted by restraint and seclusion, you can even go back to very early childhood. We see more punitive approaches on individuals that have been adopted. We see it more commonly on foster care children as well. So there's a lot of different kids that are affected. So, what I really wanted to come here today and talk about was a little bit about my experience and what had happened in our county. Because when the story broke about Frederick, I knew the data. And I felt for people that were in the situation. And when I had the opportunity to come up here and have a discussion, my first thought was, how can we help? How can we help families that have been impacted by this? How can we help get on a better road? I'm sure that again, no one likes to be in the situation, even from the perspective of the folks in the school that are now trying to figure out what to do, and all of you that have been affected by this. This is really tough. But I do think that we can influence a positive change here. Trauma's forever. Not all of that is something that will be something that will go away. What we can do is provide love and support and the right environment for our children in any way we can. But I think there's an opportunity for me, at least, to look at this and say, I don't want another child to go through what Cooper went through. I don't want another child to go through what your children went through. So that's a little bit about my story. I'm going to pause for a second, and I know we have some other things to say, and then come back for questions. Does that seem reasonable? Okay. And we'll take some questions in a minute. But again, I want to thank you for coming out tonight. And I've been working on this for almost 3.5 years. When I started this, I had a full-time job that I've been working at for almost 20 years. I never imagined in my life that suddenly I would become a children's civil rights advocate. It wasn't on my radar, but this is absolutely a civil rights issue. It's a human rights issue. It's a disability rights issue. But I think that it's up to us to do what we can to make a positive change, and I appreciate the chance to come before everybody today. So with that, I'm going to get a drink and allow you to.
Thank you so much, Guy. The next speaker that we'll have for a few minutes is our interim superintendent, Dr. Michael Marco, to come on up and just share a little bit about what we are doing moving forward as a school system.
Thank you, Linda. I would like to begin by acknowledging some of our board members that are here this evening. We have Ms. Barrett here, Mr. Bass is here, and Mrs. Yoho, and I know Mrs. Johnson is over. Thank you so much for being here this evening. Guy, I can't thank you enough for your vulnerability to share Cooper's story and the pain and the trauma that you felt as you traveled this. Shortly after the DOJ settlement was released, we met with Guy and we met with Aaron, as well as Keith Harris and Troy and Linda. We had about an hour and 15-minute conversation, and I left with my eyes wide open. as to how much we needed to work on to get where we needed to be. And you provided inspiration and hope, Guy, that we can become a better school system. And I thank you for that, because we are on a journey right now to restore the trust and the confidence and the faith in our parents for their children. And we know that that healing is going to take time. It is going to take considerable time for families to regain trust and confidence and faith in Frederick County Public Schools. But I can tell you today that we are so committed to the work. We are so committed to doing better. We want to increase our training, and we've already started taking steps to improve our training. We've started to look at UCARA. Did I say that right, Guy? We had, I want to say 7 or 8 staff members attend a UCARA training, and we learned a lot, and we feel that that's a really good strategy that we can move towards to prevent the trauma that comes with restraint. We've started to look at our BCBA supervisor. I believe we've offered a candidate to come in and start. We've started to really get out and be visible in our programs. Probably one of the biggest eye-openers is talking to many of the parents that have been impacted by restraint and seclusion. And it made me so sad to hear your stories and the experiences that you had in Frederick County Public Schools. And I feel it's so unfortunate that it took a DOJ investigation for us to change and start moving this big ship. But we're going to move this big ship, and we're going to do it together, collaboratively, with our parents, with our educators, with our board members. We will unite around this cause and make sure that we are the premier school system in the area of specialized programs and restraint. We no longer use seclusion, and we will not be going back to seclusion. We are committed to doing better. We're committed to growing. We're committed to restoring trust and faith in our families, in our employees, and our students. And I say employees because I feel, as I've peeled the layers away from this, we did not give them the tools and the resources and the training to do it right. And that's on us. And we're going to fix it. We're going to move forward, we're going to build forward, and we're going to do it together. We have a long way to go. We really do. This is going to be a long journey. But I know our board is committed to it. I know that senior staff is committed to it. I know our parents are committed to it. I know that we have great partnerships with Aaron and with Guy, and we'll continue to build those, because we need to have different ideas and different perspectives in order to get better. So, to kind of wrap this up, Guy, thank you so much. Aaron, thank you so much. Parents, we are here. We have a long ways to go, but we've started, and we are going to aggressively pursue doing things better. So thank you for your time, and thank you for attending today.
So now we're going to entertain any questions from the audience, and Guy will be available to answer questions as well as staff if the questions require that kind of answer. And so I'm going to hand this back over to Guy, and then if you'd raise your hand if you have a question.
Mr. Stevens, my name is Liz. I'm on the school board here. I'm also a special education parent. I just wanted to thank you for sharing you and your son's story. And I also wanted to thank you because the advocacy and just the work you're doing is changing the lives of children. And I think I hope that brings you some relief from the trauma your son and your family experienced. I wanted to ask, because we've talked about training, and I really wanted to specifically ask about changing culture. And I'm going to be as brief as I can here, but I think one of the things that I feel as a parent and as a board member is that even in our specialized programs, that there is a lot of typical public school environments that just don't work for a lot of kids. And when we talk about compliance, and stress responses, I can see it, even in my own children sometimes. You're not able to comply, not because you don't want to do the right thing, but because the environment, all the things that are happening, and all the expectations that are on children are just inappropriate. And I'm interested in how you change that culture, or if you think that's an issue at all.
Yeah, I would say, and first of all, thank you. I appreciate your comment as well. In my opinion and experience, I think that a lot of it, you bring up a great point. What happens when a child's having a difficult time and a child begins to feel distressed and a child begins to have behaviors? Very often, what do? We look at the child first. We look at how we can fix the child. We don't look at the environment or what might be causing distress. We don't look at, and again, this is not meant in a negative way, but we sometimes don't look at ourselves. And we have more control over the situations that we're part of than anyone else involved, especially when we're working with children. I came to a very important, I guess learned a very important lesson early on in my experience as a father. So, my first son, Cooper, autistic, had some differences and challenges that were hard for me to sometimes understand. But one of the first things that I learned that was so valuable is how important my reactions were. So very often when a child's not complying, what do? We put more demands on them. We might say them louder. We might say them slower. We might say them more deliberately. We might be hovering over the child. Dr. Bruce Perry, who is a world-renowned specialist on trauma, talks about how our emotions are contagions. And if we are escalated, we will never be able to de-escalate a child who's having a difficult time. Adults, teachers, caregivers have more influence over a child's behavior than many realize. Again, we often park it all with the child. How is the child going to address their behavior? We even go through a process where we may identify why we believe their behaviors are happening and come up with an incentive program to help them. This is not a matter of will. It's often a matter of skill. So if your perspective is, well, I'm going to offer you something so that you can do this. If I ask someone, just pretend you don't know for a second, what's the capital of Portugal? And he said, I don't know. I said, tell you what, I'm going to give you $100. What's the capital of Portugal? He said, I don't know. Here's $1,000. If the child doesn't have the skill, it doesn't matter what you're offering in terms of rewards and consequences. What really matters is how do we help them to develop the skills? So getting back to your question, at part of this is evaluating kind of our own responses. We have a tremendous amount of influence. And we've often seen, and I'm going to guess that there are some parents in this room, and raise your hand and let me know if you are, just out of curiosity, who had a child that was having a lot of behaviors in a classroom that eventually moved to another classroom, and suddenly the behaviors seemed to disappear. Anybody have that experience? I see a lot of hands going up. I know I have. You know what the biggest difference was in many of those cases? It was the staff and the staff's approach. The child didn't change. The child didn't change because they were in a new environment. But very often, people are tied to kind of these compliance-based approaches. And it's even kind of in our DNA a little bit. I'm the authority. You will do what I tell you to do. And when a child who may not have the skills to do it doesn't do it, it escalates the situation. Now, you mentioned environment. I talked to a well-known occupational therapist. We had interviewed him at one point. His name's Greg Santucci. He's in New Jersey, I believe. And we were talking about the role of occupational therapists. In my experience, the role of the occupational therapist was somewhat limited, but they have a much broader toolkit. An occupational therapist should be able to come in and look at an environment and say, what might be getting in this child's way? Are there sensory issues? A lot of kids with sensory issues. My child would sit in that first grade classroom and hear the air conditioner running down the hall. That was a distraction. I think about, there's a gentleman named Dr. Stuart Shanker. He's wrote a book called Self-Reg, if anybody's ever read that. It's a great book. But Dr. Shanker talked about being at an event. He's talking to a lot of educators. And he basically expressed his idea that there are no bad kids. And somebody raised their hand and said, no, you don't understand. I've got one. And eventually he ended up doing a consultation, going out to this classroom and trying to see what was going on. And they had this child that was really having a lot of difficulty. And Dr. Shanker came in the room with the educator. Child kind of came in, was having a lot of difficulty, not able to stay focused. After a few minutes of observing, Dr. Shanker walked over and he turned off the lights and sat back down. The child began to turn into a different child. There was a stimulus issue that was causing a problem for this child. So sometimes we do need to look at the environments. Now, does it mean that we need to start having more out-of-district placements to accommodate children? No, not necessarily. We're all going to be far better off if we can accommodate everyone in their least restrictive setting. In with their non-disabled peers is going to be ideal, but it may require additional supports. So what else can we do to support? So, thinking about the environment, maybe it's bringing in an occupational therapist. Because what do? We see behaviors, we look at the smoke, okay? We don't look at what's causing the problem, we look at the smoke. And the smoke is the behavior. We bring the behavior folks in and we begin to talk about the behavior. What are we gonna do to change the behavior? But we haven't gotten to the why. Why is that behavior really happening? So a lot of the approaches that I recommend are ones that you actually involve the child and understand what's getting in their way from their perspective to the best that you're able to do. And again, you may have to change the environments, but I'll tell you, I had a teacher on one time that we interviewed, and she said something really beautiful, and I don't know that it was her that originally came up with this, but essentially what she said is that if you treat a neurodivergent child or an autistic child, or if you treat every child like you might treat a neurodivergent child, everybody's going to benefit. So there are things that you might do differently when you're working with people that might be wired differently that in fact can benefit everyone. So sometimes we can put approaches in that actually can benefit more students. Now, again, my son did better in a small group environment. Just having lots of people could be more difficult for him. But think about ways that we can accommodate those things. Think about IDEA. We talk about, an individual, education plan. We talk about meeting individual needs. But very often it's easy to get locked into these are the programs we offer. These are the things we do. Shouldn't be a menu. We should think about how do we creatively do that. But if we start to meet those needs of children that might have higher needs, we're going to find that we better meet the needs of other people as well. So trauma-informed approaches. Trauma-informed approaches are not just for the kids. When you're looking to go further with trauma-informed approaches, and I don't know how far along the way you are, but the more you do, you've got to be trauma-informed for the teachers and staff. You cannot be a trauma-informed school if you're not also thinking about the trauma that your staff have been through. Because an adult that is dysregulated is not going to help your child when your child needs help. So there are many broader things that you can do. That was a really great question. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. You want to, oops, wherever.
Hi, I'm Karen. I'm also on the board. I was a teacher for 25 years and subbed for 12 years before that, so I've seen a lot in the classroom. You kind of just explained some things with my husband. So but I remember, kids would get really huffy with you, like, oh, why are you picking on me? And I would say to them, I didn't wake up this morning, throw a dartboard and say, I'm going to pick on you. And then it hit me one day, they didn't get up in the morning and say, I'm going to go in and make Mrs. Yoho's life miserable. So that was early in my career, fortunately. But I'm back to the original situation with your son where he didn't want to come in at recess. And I'm thinking that could easily happen with any teacher. Sure. And some of the other situations I can more easily imagine what else could be done. That one for me is a tough one. So can you give some suggestions of, because you've got your class, it's time to go in, you got to go with all the kids. So what are some things that could help a student like that to either understand how they have to come in, or how could you have adults help to deal with a student like that?
So I think there's a couple different ways that you might take that. One of the first things that I think is really critical, and I know I'm not the first one to coin this, so I can't take credit for it, but when people ask me kind of like my 3 R's of education, are relationship, relationship, relationship. Relationships are critical. And, rather than getting caught up in the compliance piece, could we have had a trusted adult come over and sit with my son and sit with him and have a conversation with him to figure out what might be going on or what kind of difficult time he might be having? Sometimes we need to drop the expectation when they're having a hard time meeting the expectation. That doesn't mean we lose. It doesn't mean it's us versus them, but sometimes we have to temporarily suspend an expectation if a child's not able to meet it. Now, what my friend Dr. Ross Green would say is, well, that's a predictable problem, isn't it? We know that certain kids have hard times with transitions. So we want to recognize that. We want to recognize when somebody's son chronically has a tough time coming in from recess. That's difficulty with transition. So how then could we proactively come up with a plan to help that child if they were having difficulties? Many of these, we sometimes hear things like what came out of nowhere. I assure you things typically don't come out of nowhere, but we might not see the signals. But an example like that, that's a transition issue. That may be a preferred activity issue. There can be a lot of things that are going on there. In the collaborative problem-solving approach, what you would do, and again, this depends on what you're able to do, but you might have what we call a Plan B conversation with a child. And a Plan B conversation looks something like this. Hey, Cooper, I see you're having difficulty coming in time for recess. What's up? What do? We ask to get a question, right? How often do we ask questions when kids are having a difficult time? Not very often. We tell them what they need to do. We tell them what they have to do. We don't often ask them why they're having a difficult time. When you begin to ask questions, you sometimes find answers that might surprise you. But what we want to do in this process is we want to understand from his perspective, why is this difficult? What's getting in his way? You might find later that it's a problem that when he goes back in from recess, he sits next to John and he have problems. You'll never find that out if you don't ask. You'll never find that out if you just simply begin to do assessments without understanding what the issue may be. So in that collaborative problem-solving model, what you do is you try to understand from the child's perspective what's getting in their way. And I will tell you that this model can be used even for children that are non-speaking children. But you try to understand what's getting in their way. And then from there, you express your adult concerns. Like, okay, well, Cooper, I understand. My concern is that if you don't come in for math class, you're not going to be able to learn the things that you need to learn. We get both problems out on the table, the child's concern, the adult concerns. Then we do something magical. We collaborate. We invite the child into helping us solve the problem. This is called collaborative problem solving. And what you do is you need to come up with a solution that's mutually agreeable, that would meet my concerns as well as the child's concerns. And then you try that. You try that with the child. You try to put in solutions having understood from their perspective where they're having a hard time. So that's one model. That's a collaborative problem-solving model. It can be used on situations like that. I often hear scenarios like, elopement's a good example. Well, they could have run into the road. Were they anywhere near the road when that was happening? As you learned in UCARA training, and people that took UCARA training, there's actually ways to handle that don't involve restraint or seclusion. But again, we often want to take a step back and understand from the child perspective what's getting in the way. And that collaborative problem-solving model is a really great model for doing that. But there are other ways as well. Yep.
My question is for the school system.
I get to drink it.
Like Guy said, some parents for some of these kids that were impacted by the seclusion and restraint are not able to advocate for their children, or might not even have an idea of what some of the paperwork is that's been coming home to families. So what is Frederick County doing to follow up with those families or any of the families, and what will that look like in the future? Are you going to be giving some resources as far as suitable counselors? I know it was I believe 12 hours of counseling, and for some of the children, a trauma therapist counseling is hard to come by now with the pandemic and everything. And finding a trauma specialist specialized therapists for like my child's nonverbal is even that much harder. So I'm just, curious as to how you're getting resources to families.
And Linda, I'm going to turn that over to you. I know that you are looking at multiple approaches to reach the different families that may have not accessed the letter or the communication the first time. So I'll go ahead and turn that question over to you.
Absolutely. So I'm going to answer your question in a couple parts. And the first part is definitely related to the first part of your question. Okay, now we've communicated with families. We've asked that if there are any families who felt like they haven't been communicated with, that we ask you to reach out to us directly. Linda Chambers at FCPS.org, Troy Keller at FCPS.org, Keith Harris at FCPS.org, Mike Marco at FCPS.org, our board members, that will get that back to us so that we can continue our process of meeting directly with each and every family to hear their concerns and understand where we are in terms of did we meet every family's needs in terms of the restraint and seclusion impact. So that's step one. And we've had additional families reach out to us. Now, you know that letters had gone out, and then letters had gone out with a survey for people to select whether A, they wanted to accept the offer, and if so, what portions. B, if they wanted to decline the offer, or C, if they wanted to discuss at an IEP team meeting. And so you make a really valid point about finding trauma therapists. So some of the things that we're navigating now is we are working through a system of call center. We're going to call each and every family now directly, one at a time. And we're going to help them individually if they haven't completed their survey for the comp offer. We are going to do it with them. Then the second piece is we're answering any questions related to what does that look like? Because we have received a lot of questions like, well, I have my own tutor. Can I use my own tutor? I have my own therapist. I want to continue that strong relationship with the therapist that I already have. Or I don't have a therapist at all, and I'm not sure my child even really needs therapy, but gee, my child is really doing an awesome job learning a certain skill. They're in high school now, and I'd like some help continuing that transition plan for their child to promote them into their next level of whatever it is they'll do in post-secondary. So those conversations will be happening likely also through an IEP team meeting that is led centrally by our staff. The piece about the therapy is definitely a concern. We've contracted with many national contracting agencies. We did that this school year through our Board of Education that approved that opportunity. That includes all the service providers in special education. And that was a smart move on our part because you're right, there are less and less available therapeutic supports for the wide ranges of students that are impacted. And those that are being used, as Guy said earlier, there you are, as Guy said earlier, we've gone through a really tough pandemic, and that has created trauma for many of us, and many families are already sought out the telehealth therapeutic supports, and they're booked, right? So we will continue to work very hard in listening closely to families, working through allocating the supports that they need when it comes to the therapeutic supports. And if we can't seek them, we still owe them, and we will find them. The other piece of that offering is missed instructional time, right? So that was the component with offering compensatory services to families and students that were impacted because in those experiences, they missed learning in the classroom. So some families are asking for tutoring. Some families we have as a pearl of our pandemic, an opportunity to have more summer programming in our school system for extended school year, for recovery services, and our Elevate program. And so depending on the ranges of needs of the students, we will be able to provide some educational missed instructional time in our summer programming before and after school. And also some families are now asking us, okay, I really want this, but I want it to be during my child's normal school day. Can we make that happen? And so those are the plans that we have to work together individually with each and every family to secure those supports of that missed instructional time as well as the therapeutic time. That's how we're navigating it. And then I'm going to go take more questions.
And while you're doing that, I was just going to mention something. So while you walk, another group that we've worked with is the Attachment and Trauma Network. And they have a list of providers from across the country. And if you look up Attachment Trauma Network, ATN, or you need information, send it to me and I'll be happy to send it to you. I was actually just at their conference recently speaking on restraint and seclusion, but they have a lot of people in their network that do specialize in trauma training. So feel free to reach out to me as well for additional information or resources.
Hi, I guess this is a question possibly for Mr. Stevens and the FCPS staff, and it's a hard one. So you talked about culture in the classroom and culture of, when we start a culture of restraining, it continues. I will say there were parents advocating in Frederick. Those parents were retaliated against and ignored. And it took the DOJ to get this taken care of. I will say I have seen some change, and I'm cautiously optimistic about that. But what are the culture changes that are going to happen in FCPS for future issues that are going to come up to prevent the DOJ having to get involved to address these kinds of extreme issues in the future?
So I'll take an initial crack from my perspective, and maybe one of you can jump in as well. And I think that's a great question, and I very much appreciate where you're coming from on that. Having had the opportunity now to work with parents literally across the country, what I found is that not all school systems are created equal. And what I mean by that is in terms of the responses that you might get when you begin advocating. Nobody was probably particularly pleased when I began bringing a lot of attention around this issue. In fact, I still have some educators that won't even look at me. And I was not trying to make their lives worse, I can assure you. I mean, I want safer schools for everybody involved. That said, over time, we managed to develop a very positive relationship and managed to really implement a positive change. But what I've seen across the country are parents who are retaliated against, parents who raise concerns, and suddenly CPS is at their door. Okay. I've seen teachers who have raised concerns and been retaliated against as well. I know that, let me think of how to put this the best way I can. When bad things happen, when people get a bad spotlight, there's often a lot of effort around kind of circling the wagons and how do we defend ourselves. And, I think that a lot of good meaning and good, well-intentioned people sometimes end up trying to protect the system. When in fact, parents that are bringing concerns, we really need to listen to. So, what I would say to you is I feel for where you're coming from. I know many parents that have had that experience. I was fortunate in the county, but it wasn't easy. I mean, it took a lot of pressure. It took a couple media stories. It took getting, I had all sorts of organizations writing them letters. What I was trying to do was amplify my voice to put pressure on them to respond. It didn't really begin to happen until I formed a relationship with someone on the board, somebody that really understood where I was coming from and was dedicated to trying to help. And through that, there was pressure put to have a committee. And that pressure to have a committee turned out to be something rather positive. But I think it's a really great question because I do think that systems inherently protect themselves. And this is not meant to be critical of anybody. This is how systems sometimes work. We see this in law enforcement settings. We see this in education. We see this in a lot of places where when things happen, the efforts are around how do we minimize damage and protect the system. This is a really great opportunity. And what I'll tell you is somebody that, has only just come here to have a couple conversations and have this discussion with you tonight. I've heard things after that first meeting, and Aaron would probably tell you, and that first meeting I went to, I had some skepticism. Are these people that really are interested in changing, or might it be a good idea to have the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint come here and talk? I left there with a much different feeling. Dr. Marco, I won't forget when at the end of the meeting you came over to me and I'd said something to you about, look, I know you don't want to be where you are. I understand this is a hard situation, but there's an opportunity to really do something and make the system better for everyone. And you came up to me at the end and said, I really want to be a model, not just for the state, but for the country. And, I've had conversations with Linda as well, where you've talked about, how difficult it is to lose trust. What I would say to you is, I think that this is the beginning of a process that I hope is really positive and impactful. And I hope that the lessons that can be gotten from this aren't limited to this situation, but that we can look at how to make sure that we are hearing voices. And it's hard. I had somebody ask me one time, like, you think about running for the board? I'm like, no. I can think of no place I would much less be right now. We've all seen board meetings and maybe been to some, maybe been on different sides of different issues, but it's a tough job, and I appreciate that. I think, again, even with working with people, like I said, with kids' relationships, I think it's critical as well where we can develop as positive relationships with staff. So my hope for Frederick County, and this is my hope, I mean, I'm just here to express my own thoughts and opinions, but is that what comes out of this leads to a positive change. And what I would encourage is that, from here going forward, those of you that have had children that have been restrained and secluded, that have children that need additional supports, that need additional help, and probably will for many years, that you make the most of these relationships that you're now able to form and really get your kids the support that they need. And I'll tell you as well, I know this is a little off topic, but, when this kind of thing happens, and somebody mentioned something earlier that hit this in my brain, but sometimes parents are led to believe the things that are happening are necessary. Like, well, we don't like to do this, but we have to. I've even heard, well, it's therapeutic, it's beneficial. Okay, there's a lot of misinformation that goes out. I don't contribute that necessarily to ill intent, but sometimes it's misinformation. People have learned a certain way of doing things, and they continue to protect those ways even when sometimes they're not the best ways of doing things. So my hope, and I'm going to pass it over to either of you that want to answer, but my hope is that this will open a door, and that what comes out of this is something that not only goes to address what's happened here, but hopefully has a lasting impact to address things in the future.
Going through the process of navigating the settlement agreement, one component that is mandated and we've stood up, and you can see it in our Regulation 444 on the www.fcps.org website under the Board of Education and Regulations, is that we built in a grievance process. And it says very clearly that anyone, student, staff, family, staff member, principal, community member, if they see something, they say something, and they inform us. They can do it orally or in writing. And as a principal, as a district leader, as a teacher, when that is brought to our attention, there is an exhibit at the end of the regulation that we will fill out for you to investigate a complaint. And it says very clearly at the end of the grievance policy that retaliation will not happen, and that any reports of that complaint are lifted up to our superintendent prior to the feedback that's provided, and there's an appeals process as well. So that was something that we had not had in place prior. And so from the school system's perspective, I wanted the people watching and the people here today to understand that we take that very seriously. And that has been stood up and approved in our regulation. And our teams, our school staff, and our the district leaders have been trained in that process. So, and that goes for everyone here. If you have yourself or someone in the community and you hear something, navigate the complaint process. Any other questions?
Can I add one quick thing to that? And that is, look around the room today. I would encourage you, to the best of your ability, to connect with each other. You know, we might feel that as a single voice, maybe that we won't be heard, but look at the people around you and connect with the people around you. You know, when as a community you can come together, I'm sure that Dr. Marco would be, happy to talk to you. And, again, look, and sometimes it's really isolating. I mean, being the parent of a child that required special education programming is somewhat of a lonelier journey. Not all of the people that you might be friends with or know are on that same journey. But when you become the parent suddenly of a kid that's had something like this happen to them, you might feel like there's nobody that understands. Even the people that understood other parts of your journey suddenly have no idea what this is like. You've got a number of people here that do today, and where you can connect with them. That's really powerful.
I come as a parent and as a staff member. I'm an SCIA, or a student special education instructional assistant. Mr. Marco, first of all, thank you for stepping up and being our interim superintendent. Under just the few months that you've been doing it, I feel confident that our future can change. I have felt more comfortable while you've been under it than I have, and I just want to thank you. Guy, thank you for coming and bringing this up to us. And I love that you guys are going to get this information to the parents, because on our front line, that is the biggest thing, is the parents. I have had numerous parents not be as involved as you. They're like, oh no, there's either they don't want to know that there's something wrong with their child. So the more advocating and more information that we can get to those parents is going to help us do our job. I don't want to have to restrain children, but I also don't want to be harmed. But I think we need the parents to be much more involved in a lot of the cases. I love the parents that are here. Thank you for being those parents that advocate for your children, but we need to recognize that there are parents out there that are not as out there, and they're just not as aware and open to that. As far as the training that you speak of, please ensure that it trickles down to us. We are the ones working one-on-one with your child, but I feel personally, and so do many of my colleagues, our voice is not heard. We're the ones spending 7 hours with your child, but yet we are not often brought into the discussion. We're not allowed in the IEP meetings. We're not allowed in there. And I'm just like, I understand the SPED teacher asks me for my input, but I do feel, shouldn't I have a voice as well? So along with that training, just make sure it doesn't stop at teachers, it doesn't stop at administration, it gets all the way down, and maybe open it up so that we're heard. There's times that we are felt like we are the bottom of the barrel, when it's like, yo, we're the ones getting beat up. We're the ones literally breaking fingers. We're the ones getting our bones broken, but yet no one hears us. Maybe I need to get my staff to be more vociferous, but it stops at like, oh, you don't have a teaching degree, so you don't matter. I don't think so. So please ensure that it gets all the way down and recognize those of us on the front lines as well. I would love to know as well. I'm not sure. I have been an SCIA now for 6 years, and I have never once been in an IEP meeting, and neither have my, do you need, oh, okay, so I don't know what it is. I take all the data, I am sitting there, I'm the one knowing 100% what my student knows. But I'm supposed to relay that to the SPED teacher because they have their specialized degree, and then they go on. But I can't communicate. Most of the times I'm told not to communicate with the parent. It has to go through the SPED teacher. If I write a note home to the parent letting them know, my note has to be positive. If I have any constructive criticism, it has to go through the SPED teacher, which has to go through all these other different channels. And okay. But again, yeah, I don't know. Maybe it is a cultural thing. Maybe they just think, oh, well, you're paid nothing. I don't know. I don't know what it is. So please, yeah.
I want you to be mic'd.
We will change that starting tomorrow. That's not acceptable. You are probably the closest to that student every day, and you're the expert. Unless it's against the law. In my former life, it was not against the law. That will change tomorrow.
Hi, sorry, Kathy Lakey, ARC Board President, and a parent of 2 special ed students. First and foremost, I do want to thank FCPS. They have been wonderful in supporting my 2 children, but yes, things could have been better for them along the way. And I know many other children that it was not, including sitting in on IEP meetings with friends as support. And to piggyback on what she said, yes, I actually requested one of my children's aides in an IEP meeting. It was flat shut down on that. No, we don't do that. So that's happened to me several times. And don't think for a minute that I didn't back channel that anyway to get to know what was going on. We parents have our ways. One of the things I wanted to ask, one of my students, one of my kids has gone through several programs through FCPS challenges, Learning for Life, and is now in the Success program. Wonderful programs, but over the last few, I'd say decade, I was going to say years, but I'd say decade, I've noticed in these programs more aides disappearing. There are more students coming in and less aides. What ratio are you targeting student to aide? Because one of the biggest issues is these triggers, these little things that are going on, like you said, occupational therapy or whatever, these little triggers that are going on, they're getting missed. And the aides know the triggers. They work very closely with these students. But when they're watching 3 or 4 kids, when they have 3 or 4 kids that they are sitting at a table with, they're going to miss. And if they're not on it early enough to de-escalate, it's gonna escalate. And then a student, I can only speak from the perspective of autism. I have 2 autistic kids. That, once that escalation gets going, it's kind of hard to bring them back down. And if you can see it early, you can stop it and you can actually intervene a lot sooner. And you don't have to get to that point where a child is melting down. Even just preparation for a transition, just having the staff to have the time, instead of just, it's time for everybody to dismiss to the bus, but this one student, it's going to be a little bit different for this one student, but no one's had time to prepare this one student that something's going to be different. No one's had time to sit down and say, okay, here's a social story for what's going to happen at dismissal time today. You're going to walk with me and so, we're going to go to the front office, and we're going to take so and so out to the car, and then I'm going to walk you to your bus instead of normally walking straight to the bus. Little changes like that can really trigger an autistic, I know that much. And just having the staff on hand, the number of staff on hand to be able to take care of that. And right now, I'm just wondering what I know you're looking to hire special education teachers, aides, to beef things back up. What are your target ratios right now?
I would say in our specialized programs right now, one of the target ratios that I would like to pursue would be 7 to 9 students per adult in our specialized program. I think that's going to be very important moving forward. The other area that we need to improve considerably on that I shared with the board is we are not providing enough training prior to an instructional assistant going into their program. And what I'm going to propose moving forward, whether you're hired in August or January, that prior to going into your assignment as an SEIA, that you have 5 days of training. Part of that training would be observing the classroom that you're going to be in or observing the student that you're going to be in, because you quickly may look at the situation and say, I am not equipped to be in a situation like that, so let's either part ways now, or can you find me another assignment? So training is going to be critical moving forward for our SEIAs, allowing them to observe their assignment, the classroom or the student that they're working in. And I think the board's commitment to not only increasing compensation, but providing benefits will move us a long way in recruiting the SEIAs that we need to move forward. So training, compensation, benefits, and having a voice, which I heard from you loud and clear, you need a voice.
We are so thankful for everyone to be here today. We're going to stay true to our time frame, and Guy is going to provide some closing statements. I just wanted to share that as Dr. Marco has shared, as the sentiments have been shared here tonight, and as Guy has been so informative and helpful in having us have a different perspective about how things worked in Calvert County for Cooper. We are a district that is committed to building and healing forward. We are committed to rebuilding in this community of Frederick in partnerships with other organizations in Frederick and beyond to be able to restore respect and dignity, not only to our students and their families, but to our staff and the whole community. When students feel safe and when staff feels safe, they can learn.
So just a couple kind of closing comments, and I just want to kind of add on to your answer that you were responding to a moment ago. And I love the dedication that I hear to what you're saying that you want to do, and a great question. The other thing that I hope that happens out of this, and I think it will, is that if you can change the culture here in Frederick County Public Schools, if we can move away from many of the punitive approaches that are being taken and work with kids, work in a trauma-informed approach. I said this, I think, when we met, initially I said, you need to reach out and talk to the teachers and staff. You need to reach out and talk to the parents, because suddenly all of this has happened and nobody really knows kind of what is what, and people are feeling a lot of different ways. But I do think that, again, the changes that need to happen are not just changes to better support our kids, but better support our teachers and staff, because only can staff and teachers that are well supported support our kids appropriately. So, as we look at trauma-informed approaches, as we look at other ways of supporting people, it means that trauma-informed approach is not just something we don't just take a 30-minute training on trauma-informed approaches and say, guess what, we're trauma-informed. It means we really understand. It means that people that are instructional aides or assistants have gone through enough of that training to understand it as well. But it also means that our approaches in working with the staff and the teachers and other are also trauma-informed. There's a school in Tennessee called Fall Hamilton Elementary. It's run by a gentleman named Matthew Portell. And Matthew Portell runs a group called the Trauma Informed Educators Network. In fact, he's having a conference coming up in, I think, June or July, where they have a lot of educators that come together to talk about trauma-informed practices. But at his school, Fall Hamilton Elementary, they made a decision that they were going to really turn the culture into a trauma-informed culture. And what that meant was they were being trauma-informed to the staff and teachers. They were understanding their challenges, their difficulties, their stress, and meeting that and working with people to make sure that they had the support that they needed. Because again, you know, a dysregulated adult is never going to help a dysregulated child. So it's really important. And I think if you do that, I look at Matthew's school and I think, wow, what happened there is they created a school people wanted to come to. And I'm not just talking about parents and kids. I'm talking about staff. Staff said, this is a place we want to be. And if you can make that kind of culture shift to really take that and weave it into the fabric of Frederick County Public Schools, sorry, I have LEFs in my head, you could make a significant change. And no longer now are you competing with the surrounding counties because people will want to come here because of the way that you're supporting people. And it's above dollars and cents. Dollars and cents are important, right? But there's so much more that goes into satisfaction. I think we all know that. Anybody that's worked a job that might not have been the best job in the world when it came to money, but had somebody that really appreciated you, really stood with you, really tried to support you. And I think that that's what at least that's what I've heard that you really want to do. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity here. With that, I just want to go back to the beginning here. You know, I'm really sorry for all of you that have gone through the experiences that you've had. And again, you know, whether you're parents or whether you're staff, I mean, I'm empathetic to staff that have been, you know, had broken bones, had, you know, been injured, had lots of bad things happening. We want safer schools for everybody. We want safer schools for the students, the teachers, and the staff. And we can only do that if we're following approaches that are going to be supportive for everybody in the system as well. So we're in this together, and I do think, and again, it's a hard place to be. You know, we're talking December when all of this hit, and I'll tell you, my December was a little bit before this. My December was actually October, but it took me a while to really kind of get past a lot of the raw feelings I had and try to figure out how we could do something to make a positive difference. And, you know, that's my hope. My hope is, you know, I wish we weren't here. I wish we weren't in this room, but we are, and we have the potential to do something. And again, I hope it goes much deeper than this issue. I hope it addresses kind of what you're talking about as well, in making sure that, you know, we've got a system that then is, you know, I've heard it from teachers as well, you know, that have been, you know, I had a teacher, young teacher in Alaska that reached out to me one day and said, look, you know, they're using a lot of restraint seclusion. I'm really concerned about it. I talked to the principal. I didn't think it was a good approach. Well, they took that young teacher and surrounded her by about 20 other staff that said, look, we've got to do this. We don't like it either, but we've got to do this. It's easy to find yourself in those positions, but I think we've got to really make effort to move forward. So I appreciate, you know, being willing to have me come and talk to you all initially. You know, when I heard this story, you know, I was really interested in, you know, kind of what had happened and how, you know, might be able to move forward into a better direction. So I appreciate the invitation to join here this evening. Any of you that are interested, I'll be here for a few minutes if you want to come and ask me something that maybe you didn't want to ask with a microphone. I've got some literature over there by the cooler as well if you want to grab something. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy if I can, even if it's just a conversation, if I can help in any way. So I want to thank you all for having me here tonight. And again, if there's anything I can do for anybody, please don't hesitate to ask. And thank you for hearing my story.